The Abrahamic Bible. The Ten Commandments of Abrahamism. Commandment 1. Worship only one God, eternal and indivisible, creator of all. Commandment 2. Reject all idols and false deities in thought and action. Commandment 3. Trust in God's promises, even in the face of uncertainty. Commandment 4. Obey God's commands with unwavering faith and submission. Commandment 5. Practice justice and righteousness in all dealings with others. Commandment 6. Show hospitality and compassion to strangers and the needy. Commandment 7. Honor the covenant through circumcision and acts of dedication. Commandment 8. Teach monotheism and God's ways to your family and community. Commandment 9. Build altars for prayer and offerings to glorify God alone. Commandment 10. Seek God's blessing for all nations through a life of faith. Chapter 1. The Call of Abraham. Verse 1. God spoke to Abraham, saying, "Leave your land for a place I will show you." Verse 2. Abraham trusted God, departing Ur with faith in one Creator. Verse 3. He left his kin, forsaking idols for the eternal God. Verse 4. In Canaan, he pitched his tent, guided by divine promise. Verse 5. God vowed, "I will make you a great nation, blessed forever." Verse 6. Abraham walked in faith, seeking the land of God's choosing. Verse 7. He built an altar in Shechem, worshiping the one true God. Verse 8. His heart was steadfast, trusting in God's holy word. Verse 9. God promised, "Your name shall be great among all peoples." Verse 10. Abraham followed, leaving all for the Creator's call. Verse 11. In Bethel, he called on God, proclaiming monotheism's truth. Verse 12. God said, "Through you, all nations shall find blessing and truth." Chapter 2. The Covenant. Verse 1. God pledged to Abraham, "Your offspring shall be as stars in the sky." Verse 2. Abraham believed, counting God's promise as truth eternal. Verse 3. In a vision, God spoke, sealing the covenant with fire. Verse 4. Abraham offered sacrifice, binding his soul to God. Verse 5. God said, "Canaan shall be your descendants' inheritance forever." Verse 6. Abraham built an altar, sealing his bond with the eternal God. Verse 7. He trusted God's word, though years passed without a son. Verse 8. God declared, "Your seed shall bless the earth's nations." Verse 9. Abraham knelt, worshiping the Creator of heaven and earth. Verse 10. God renamed him Abraham, father of many nations. Verse 11. The covenant stood firm, a light for all who believe. Verse 12. God named him Abraham, father of nations, bound by faith. Chapter 3. Trials of Faith. Verse 1. God tested Abraham, saying, "Offer your son as a sacrifice." Verse 2. Abraham rose early, trusting God's command without fear. Verse 3. He took his son to Moriah, obedient to divine will. Verse 4. With faith unyielding, Abraham prepared the altar for sacrifice. Verse 5. God provided a ram, sparing the son of promise. Verse 6. Abraham trusted, raising the knife, yet God spared his son. Verse 7. His obedience shone, a testament to unwavering faith. Verse 8. God blessed Abraham, saying, "Your faith has pleased me." Verse 9. Through trials, Abraham proved his heart belonged to God. Verse 10. He named the place God provides, honoring divine mercy. Verse 11. Abraham's trials taught believers to trust in God's plan. Verse 12. Through trials, Abraham's faith shone as a light to all. Chapter 4. Rejection of idols. Verse 1. Abraham shattered the idols of Ur, proclaiming one true God. Verse 2. He turned from falsehood, seeking the Creator of all. Verse 3. In Ur's streets, he spoke against the worship of stone. Verse 4. God's voice called him to forsake the gods of his kin. Verse 5. Abraham declared, "Only one God rules the heavens." Verse 6. He taught his people to reject the idol's empty promises. Verse 7. In Canaan, he stood firm against polytheistic ways. Verse 8. His words stirred hearts, turning many to monotheism. Verse 9. He taught his household, "Worship only the Creator of all." Verse 10. Abraham's faith broke the chains of idolatrous darkness. Verse 11. He proclaimed God's unity, guiding souls to truth. Verse 12. His words broke the chains of falsehood, guiding nations to truth. Chapter 5. Righteous living. Verse 1. Abraham welcomed strangers, sharing bread under the oaks of Mamre. Verse 2. His tent was open, reflecting God's compassion for all. Verse 3. He served with humility, honoring guests as God's own. Verse 4. He sought justice, pleading for the righteous in Sodom's fall. Verse 5. Abraham's heart was pure, seeking fairness in all deeds. Verse 6. He taught his kin to walk in righteousness before God. Verse 7. His life was a model, guiding others to moral paths. Verse 8. Abraham judged disputes with wisdom, honoring God's truth. Verse 9. He showed mercy, caring for the poor and needy. Verse 10. His actions spoke louder than words, teaching righteous living. Verse 11. Abraham's justice inspired nations to seek God's way. Verse 12. His life taught all to walk in righteousness before God. Chapter 6. The Land of Promise. Verse 1. God said, "This land of Canaan shall be your inheritance." Verse 2. Abraham walked its hills, trusting God's sacred promise. Verse 3. He pitched his tent in Hebron, claiming God's gift. Verse 4. God's word was sure, a covenant for Abraham's seed. Verse 5. Abraham gazed at the stars, believing in God's pledge. Verse 6. He honored God, building altars across the promised land. Verse 7. Canaan's fields bore witness to Abraham's faithful steps. Verse 8. Abraham walked its length, trusting God's eternal word. Verse 9. God affirmed, "This land is yours for generations unending." Verse 10. Abraham's faith made Canaan a beacon of divine promise. Verse 11. He taught his heirs to cherish the land of God's covenant. Verse 12. The land became a sign of God's unending faithfulness. Chapter 7. Circumcision. Verse 1. God commanded, "Circumcise your household as my covenant's mark." Verse 2. Abraham obeyed, sealing his faith with a sacred sign. Verse 3. He gathered his kin, binding them to God's promise. Verse 4. Circumcision marked Abraham's people as God's chosen ones. Verse 5. Abraham led by example, honoring God's holy command. Verse 6. The sign united his household in faith and devotion. Verse 7. God blessed the circumcised, affirming the covenant's truth. Verse 8. Abraham taught, "This mark is our bond with God." Verse 9. His obedience strengthened the faith of future generations. Verse 10. Circumcision became a symbol of Abraham's trust in God. Verse 11. The covenant sign endured, a testament to divine will. Verse 12. The sign endures, uniting believers in faith and obedience. Chapter 8. Hospitality. Verse 1. Abraham opened his tent, feeding travelers in God's name. Verse 2. Under Mamre's oaks, he served with a generous heart. Verse 3. His kindness welcomed strangers, reflecting God's boundless love. Verse 4. Abraham bowed low, honoring guests as divine messengers. Verse 5. He shared his bread, teaching hospitality to his kin. Verse 6. God blessed Abraham's tent, a haven for weary souls. Verse 7. His actions showed all to care for those in need. Verse 8. Abraham's hospitality spread God's mercy to distant lands. Verse 9. He taught, serve others, for in them God is present. Verse 10. His kindness blessed strangers, showing God's mercy to all. Verse 11. Abraham's open heart inspired nations to welcome others. Verse 12. Hospitality became a pillar of Abraham's righteous path. Chapter 9. Intercession. Verse 1. Abraham stood before God, pleading for Sodom's salvation. Verse 2. His heart sought mercy, praying for the righteous few. Verse 3. God heard Abraham, honoring his compassionate plea. Verse 4. He interceded boldly, seeking justice for the innocent. Verse 5. Abraham's prayers reflected God's mercy for all creation. Verse 6. He stood as a servant, asking God to spare the city. Verse 7. His intercession taught believers to seek God's grace. Verse 8. Abraham's voice carried hope for those under judgment. Verse 9. He pleaded, spare the righteous, O God of justice. Verse 10. His heart sought mercy, reflecting God's compassion for all. Verse 11. Abraham's prayers united his people in seeking mercy. Verse 12. Intercession marked Abraham as a servant of divine will. Chapter 10. Universal blessing. Verse 1. God declared, all people shall find blessing through you. Verse 2. Abraham's faith carried God's promise to every nation. Verse 3. He taught all to worship the one eternal Creator. Verse 4. His covenant united tribes under God's singular truth. Verse 5. Abraham's obedience opened God's grace to the world. Verse 6. He spread monotheism, calling nations to one God. Verse 7. God's blessing flowed through Abraham's faithful heart. Verse 8. His life inspired peoples to seek the Creator's light. Verse 9. Abraham's faith united nations under one God's light. Verse 10. He taught, all are blessed through faith in one God. Verse 11. His covenant called humanity to unity and truth. Verse 12. His legacy calls all to worship the eternal Creator. Chapter 11. Transmission of faith. Verse 1. Abraham gathered his family, teaching God's singular truth. Verse 2. He spoke to Isaac and Ishmael, sharing monotheism's light. Verse 3. His words guided his household to reject all idols. Verse 4. Abraham taught, keep God's ways in your hearts. Verse 5. His faith passed to his sons, a legacy of truth. Verse 6. He called his kin to worship the one true God. Verse 7. Abraham's teachings endured through generations of believers. Verse 8. He instructed his people to live justly before God. Verse 9. His words endured, guiding generations to one God. Verse 10. Abraham's voice carried faith to distant lands and times. Verse 11. His household became a beacon of monotheistic truth. Verse 12. The faith of Abraham lives in the hearts of his heirs. Chapter 12. Eternal Legacy. Verse 1. Abraham's covenant stands, a beacon for all humanity. Verse 2. His faith endures, guiding nations to one God. Verse 3. God's promise through Abraham blesses all who believe. Verse 4. His life calls nations to worship one God forever. Verse 5. Abraham's obedience shines as a light for eternity. Verse 6. His covenant unites believers in faith and truth. Verse 7. God honored Abraham, making his name great forever. Verse 8. His teachings guide the faithful to righteous paths. Verse 9. Abraham's legacy calls all to trust in God's word. Verse 10. His faith remains a foundation for monotheism's truth. Verse 11. God's covenant through Abraham endures for all time. Verse 12. In Abraham's faith, God's promise shines for eternity.